Seated in the lotus position, I observe the rising sun painting the sky with shades of orange and pink. The cool morning air caresses my face, bringing with it the subtle aroma of incense and wildflowers. I'm at the top of a hill, overlooking the monastery that has been my home for the past 20 years. My name is Timothy, and this is my journey as a Buddhist monk in the modern era. I wasn't always a seeker of inner peace. There was a time when my life was a whirlwind of uncontrolled emotions, unbridled ambitions, and an emptiness that seemed impossible to fill. I was born into a middle-class family in a large, bustling city. My parents were good people, but they were always busy chasing after the material success they believed would bring us happiness. I grew up believing that happiness lay in the things I could possess, in the achievements I could attain. I studied hard, graduated from a prestigious university, and soon found myself trapped in the corporate gears, working long hours in pursuit of promotions and salary increases. However, the more I achieved, the emptier I felt. The constant stress, permanent anxiety, and the feeling that something crucial was missing in my life led me to a breaking point. It was at this moment of crisis that I found Buddhism. I vividly remember the day I walked into a small bookstore, seeking something, anything, that could alleviate my anguish. My eyes fell on a simple book with a cover showing a monk smiling serenely. The title read, "The Art of Living Buddhist Teachings for the Modern World." That book was my first introduction to the teachings of the Buddha, and it completely changed my perspective on life. I learned about the Four Noble Truths and the Noble Eightfold Path, concepts that seemed so simple and yet profoundly transformative. The first noble truth, the existence of suffering, dukkha, resonated strongly with me. I realized that my incessant pursuit of satisfaction through external achievements was actually the source of my suffering. The second noble truth, the origin of suffering, made me understand that my desires and attachments were at the root of my dissatisfaction. Fascinated by these teachings, I began attending a local meditation center. It was there that I learned the fundamentals of mindfulness practice. At first, I found it extremely difficult to sit in silence and observe my breath. My mind jumped from thought to thought like a restless monkey. But with practice and patience, I began to notice subtle changes. Moments of clarity and calm began to emerge amidst the chaos of my thoughts. Slowly, I learned to observe my thoughts and emotions without completely identifying with them. One day, during a particularly challenging meditation session, I had an experience that changed everything. I was struggling with thoughts of anxiety about a big project at work, when suddenly, as if a curtain had been lifted, I saw with crystal clarity the transient nature of my thoughts and worries. In that moment, I experienced a profound peace I had never known before. I realized that my thoughts were like clouds passing through the sky of my consciousness. I could observe them without being carried away by them. This understanding of the impermanence of all things, including our mental states, is one of the fundamental principles of Buddhism. Inspired by this experience, I began applying the practice of mindfulness in all aspects of my life. At work, instead of stressing about deadlines and expectations, I learned to stay calm and focus on the present moment. In personal relationships, I began practicing attentive listening, really paying attention to the people around me without judging or trying to control. The results were remarkable. My stress level decreased significantly. My relationships improved, and for the first time in years I began to feel a genuine sense of contentment. However, my journey was just beginning. The more I practiced and studied Buddhist teachings, the more I realized how deep and transformative they could be. I began to question the choices I had made in my life and ask myself if I was really living according to my deepest values. It was during this time that I met Venerable John, an American Zen master, during a mindfulness retreat. His simple but profound words touched my heart in a way I'll never forget. "Peace is in every step," he said. "The here and now is the only moment in which life exists." These words reverberated within me, making me realize that I had spent much of my life worrying about the future or regretting the past, missing the only moment in which we can truly live, the present. Inspired by his teachings, I began practicing walking meditation, a form of moving meditation that involves walking slowly with full awareness of each step. This practice taught me to bring mindfulness to everyday activities, transforming even the most mundane tasks into opportunities to cultivate inner peace. As I deepened my practice, I began to notice significant changes in my life. The stress at work, which had previously seemed unbearable, became more manageable. Instead of automatically reacting to difficult situations, I learned to pause, breathe, and respond with more calmness and clarity. My relationships also began to flourish. By practicing compassionate listening and mindful speech, I learned to communicate more effectively and empathetically. I realized that many of the conflicts I had experienced in the past were the result of misunderstandings and lack of true communication. A striking example of this occurred with my father. For years, we had a tense relationship, full of unmet expectations and truncated communication. Determined to apply what I had learned, I invited him for coffee. Instead of trying to convince him of my point of view or defend myself, I simply practiced attentive listening. For the first time, I really heard his concerns, fears, and hopes. By the end of the conversation, we both had tears in our eyes, feeling a connection that had long been lost. This event made me realize the transformative power of compassion and understanding. I began to see that all beings, regardless of their actions, seek happiness and want to avoid suffering. This understanding helped me develop more empathy, even in challenging situations. As my practice deepened, I began to explore the Buddhist concept of non-self, or anatta. This teaching proposes that there is no fixed and unchanging self, but rather a continuous flow of experiences, thoughts, and sensations. At first, I found this concept difficult to understand and accept. After all, I had always seen myself as a separate and distinct entity. But through the practice of meditation and self-observation, I began to see the truth in this teaching. I realized that my identity was not fixed, but fluid and constantly changing. The tastes, opinions, and even the personality that I considered me were constantly evolving. This understanding brought me a sense of freedom I had never experienced before. With this new perspective, I began to cling less to my opinions and be more open to different points of view. This not only improved my relationships, but also made me more adaptable and resilient in the face of life's changes. One day, during a morning walk, I had an epiphany. Observing the leaves falling from the trees, I deeply understood the impermanent nature of all things. I realized that just as the seasons change, everything in life is in constant flux. This understanding filled me with a sense of peace and acceptance. It was at this moment that I made a decision that would change the course of my life. I decided to leave my corporate career and dedicate myself fully to the study and practice of Buddhism. It wasn't an easy decision, and many of my friends and family thought I was crazy. But I knew deep in my heart that this was the right path for me. I sold most of my belongings, donated a good portion to charities, and with a backpack on my back, set out in search of a monastery that could accept me as a novice. My journey took me to different parts of the world, from Zen monasteries in California to meditation retreats in New Mexico. Each experience brought new insights and challenges. I learned that the spiritual path is not always easy or comfortable, but each obstacle is an opportunity for growth. If you're enjoying the advice, consider subscribing to the channel. Thank you. We return to the story. Finally, I found my spiritual home in a small monastery in the Rocky Mountains. It was there that I took my monastic vows and adopted the name Timothy, which means honoring God. Life in the monastery was simple, but deeply satisfying. We woke up before dawn for morning meditation, followed by daily tasks such as cleaning, gardening, and studying Buddhist texts. Each activity was an opportunity to practice mindfulness and cultivate wisdom. One of the most important lessons I learned was about detachment. In the monastery, we had few personal possessions, and this taught me that true happiness doesn't come from accumulating material goods, but from inner peace and meaningful connections we make. I remember a day when I was sweeping the monastery courtyard. As I swept, I noticed how my mind wandered to the past, thinking about all the things I had left behind: my luxurious apartment, my sports car, my well-stocked bank account. For a moment, I felt a pang of regret. But then, I took a deep breath and brought my attention back to the present moment. I felt the broom handle in my hands, heard the soft sound of leaves being swept, saw the beauty of the mountains around me. In that instant, I realized I had everything I needed. The simplicity of my current life brought me a peace that all the luxury in the world couldn't buy. This lesson in detachment extended beyond material possessions. I learned not to cling rigidly to ideas, opinions, or even my own identity. This brought me a mental flexibility that made it much easier to deal with life's changes and challenges. Another fundamental practice I learned at the monastery was loving kindness meditation, or metta bhavana. This practice involves cultivating feelings of loving kindness, first for oneself, then for loved ones, for neutral people, for difficult people, and finally for all beings. At first, I found this practice challenging, especially when it came to directing feelings of kindness towards people with whom I had conflicts. But over time I realized how it was transforming my heart. Gradually, I began to see all beings with more compassion and understanding. A powerful example of this occurred when I received news that a former work colleague, who had always been hostile to me, was going through a difficult time. Instead of feeling satisfaction or indifference, my heart filled with compassion. I sent him a message of support, expecting nothing in return. To my surprise, this led to a reconciliation and the beginning of a genuine friendship. As the years passed in the monastery, my understanding of Buddhist teachings deepened. I learned about the concepts of karma and rebirth, not as dogmas to be blindly accepted, but as principles to be investigated through personal experience. Karma, I understood, is not a system of punishment and reward, but rather the natural law of cause and effect. Every action we perform, whether with body, speech, or mind, has consequences. This understanding made me more aware of my actions and their potential repercussions. As for rebirth, I learned to see it not just as something that happens after death, but as an ongoing process that occurs every moment. Every instant, we die to the previous moment and are reborn in the next. This perspective helped me embrace change and see each moment as an opportunity for a new beginning. One of the most profound experiences I had at the monastery was during a 30-day silent retreat. During this period, we didn't speak or communicate in any way, except for necessary instructions. We spent most of the day in meditation, alternating between sitting and walking sessions. In the first few days, my mind was restless, full of thoughts and memories. But gradually, as I surrendered to the practice, I began to experience states of clarity and tranquility that I had never known before. In a particularly powerful moment, I had an experience that Buddhists call insight into the nature of reality. For a brief instant, I clearly saw the interconnection of all things, the illusory nature of the ego, and the true essence of existence. It was a profound and transformative experience that shaped my practice and my life from then on. In the days that followed, I found myself reflecting on this experience, trying to integrate it into my understanding of the world and myself. I realized that the emotional control I sought was not a repression of emotions, but rather a deeper understanding of their nature and origin. One morning, while meditating under a tree in the monastery garden, I had another powerful insight. I realized that our emotions are like waves in the ocean of our consciousness. They arise, grow, and eventually dissipate. The secret is not in trying to stop the waves, but in learning to surf them with grace and balance. I shared this reflection with my master during our next teaching session. He smiled gently and said, "Very good, young monk. You're beginning to understand. But remember, the real challenge is applying this knowledge in everyday life." His words inspired me to seek ways to bring this understanding to practical situations. I began to observe my emotional reactions more closely, not to judge them but to understand them better. For example, once during a temple cleaning task, I accidentally dropped and broke an ancient and valuable vase. My immediate reaction was panic and self-recrimination. But then, remembering the teachings, I took a deep breath and observed these emotions arising in my mind. I realized that the fear and guilt were conditioned reactions, not the reality of the situation. I accepted what had happened, acknowledged my responsibility without judging myself harshly, and focused on cleaning up the shards and reporting the incident to the monk in charge. To my surprise, when I reported the incident, the senior monk smiled and said, "Excellent. You've given us a perfect opportunity to practice detachment and acceptance of impermanence. Now let's meditate on this together." This experience taught me a valuable lesson about how our emotional reactions shape our reality. If I had given in to panic and guilt, I would have created more suffering for myself and others. Instead, by practicing mindfulness and acceptance, I transformed an accident into an opportunity for growth. As the months passed, I began to notice subtle but significant changes in my behavior and mental state. Situations that previously left me anxious or irritated now seemed less challenging. I learned to stop, breathe, and observe my emotions before reacting. A practice I found particularly useful was cultivating gratitude. Every morning, before starting my daily tasks, I would spend a few minutes reflecting on the things I was grateful for. This could be something as simple as the air I breathed, the food in my bowl, or the opportunity to learn and grow. This practice of gratitude had a profound effect on my perspective. I began to see beauty and value in things I had previously considered common or insignificant. This in turn increased my sense of contentment and reduced my attachment to material desires. One day, during a lecture for monastery visitors, I shared some of these experiences and practices. In the middle of my speech, I paused and said, "If you're enjoying the advice, consider subscribing to the channel. Thank you, we return to the story." This phrase was a reminder we used to keep our listeners engaged, a practice that mixed tradition with modernity in a unique way. Continuing my lecture, I emphasized the importance of patience in the process of emotional control. I explained that just as a tree doesn't grow overnight, mastering our emotions is a gradual process that requires constant practice and self-compassion. To illustrate this point, I shared a personal story. When I first entered the monastery, I was impatient and easily frustrated. I wanted to achieve enlightenment immediately and would get irritated when things didn't happen at my desired pace. One day, my master gave me the task of taking care of the monastery's Zen garden. I was to rake the sand every day, creating perfect patterns. At first, I found the task tedious and meaningless, but over time, I began to see how each movement of the rake was an opportunity to practice mindfulness. I learned to focus my attention on the present moment, on the movement of the rake, on the sound of the sand being moved. Gradually, the task became a form of moving meditation, and to my surprise, I began to notice that this practice was affecting other areas of my life. I became more patient in my interactions with others, more tolerant of the small annoyances of daily life. I realized that, just as I couldn't force the sand to form perfect patterns immediately, I also couldn't force my spiritual growth or that of others. This lesson in patience and acceptance proved invaluable in my journey of emotional control. I learned that emotions, like the sand in the Zen garden, are in constant flux. Our task is not to try to control them completely, but rather to learn to work with them in a skillful and compassionate way. As I continued my practice, I began to realize that true emotional control wasn't about suppressing or denying our emotions, but rather about developing a wiser and more balanced relationship with them. It was about creating space between stimulus and response, allowing us to choose how to react instead of being dominated by automatic reactions. A practice I found particularly useful in this aspect was compassion meditation, or metta bhavana. In this practice, we begin by generating feelings of love and kindness for ourselves, then gradually expand these feelings to include other people, even those we find difficult. At first, I found it challenging to generate these feelings, especially for people I considered difficult. But with persistent practice, I began to notice a subtle shift in my attitude. I became more understanding and less judgmental, both with myself and with others. One incident in particular illustrated the impact of this practice in my life. One day, while I was in the nearby town doing shopping for the monastery, a man rudely bumped into me, knocking down my bags. My instinctive reaction was irritation, but before I could express it, I remembered my compassion practice. I took a deep breath and asked myself, what could be happening in this person's life to make them act this way? Maybe he was going through a difficult time, or maybe he was just having a bad day. Instead of reacting with anger, I offered a gentle smile and asked if he was okay. To my surprise, the man stopped, looked at me with an expression of shock, and then began to apologize profusely. He explained that he had just lost his job and was so distracted by his worries that he wasn't paying attention to where he was going. That moment of compassion not only avoided an unpleasant confrontation, but also created a genuine human connection. The man helped me gather my groceries, and we ended up having a meaningful conversation about life's difficulties and the importance of kindness. This experience taught me the transformative power of compassion. By responding with kindness, instead of reactivity, we not only improve our own emotions, but also have the potential to positively impact the lives of others. As my practice deepened, I began to realize that emotional control wasn't a final state to be achieved, but rather an ongoing journey. Each day brought new challenges and opportunities to practice and grow. One of the most important lessons I learned was about the nature of happiness. Many people seek emotional control in the hope of eliminating all negative emotions and living in a state of perpetual happiness. However, I discovered that this pursuit often leads to frustration and suffering. Instead, I learned to see happiness not as a constant emotional state, but as an ability to be present and at peace with whatever the experience of the moment might be. This included the ability to be with difficult emotions without being overwhelmed by them. For example, when I received news that a beloved family member had passed away, I allowed myself to fully feel the sadness and grief. I didn't try to suppress these emotions or force myself to be happy. Instead, I used my practice to create a space of acceptance and compassion for my pain. I meditated on the impermanent nature of all things, including life itself. I reflected on the gratitude I felt for having known and loved this person. And in doing so, I discovered that it was possible to experience a sense of peace even amidst sadness. This experience taught me that true emotional control isn't about not feeling difficult emotions, but rather about how we relate to those emotions. It's about developing the capacity to be present with our experiences, whether pleasant or unpleasant, without getting lost in them. As I shared these lessons with others, whether through formal lectures or casual conversations, I began to see the impact these practices could have on people's lives. I saw visitors to the monastery arrive stressed and anxious and leave with a new sense of calm and purpose. One particularly striking case was that of a young woman who came to the monastery in a state of deep depression. She had lost her job, ended a long-term relationship, and was struggling to find meaning in her life. During her stay, I taught her some basic mindfulness and emotional control practices. I encouraged her to start each day with a brief gratitude meditation, to practice mindfulness in her daily activities, and to use the stop and breathe technique when feeling overwhelmed. Weeks later, I received a letter from her. She wrote that although her external circumstances hadn't changed drastically, her perspective and ability to cope with challenges had transformed. She had begun to see her difficulties not as insurmountable obstacles, but as opportunities for growth and learning. This letter reminded me of the transformative power of these practices and reinforced my commitment to sharing them with as many people as possible. I realized that emotional control wasn't just a personal practice, but a powerful tool for creating positive change in the world. As the years passed, I continued to deepen my practice and refine my understanding of emotional control. I learned that just as a gardener patiently tends to their plants, we must constantly cultivate our emotional balance. A practice that became central to my daily routine was what I call an emotional check-in. Several times a day, I would pause to observe my emotional state, not to judge or try to change what I was feeling, but simply to acknowledge and accept my emotions in the present moment. This practice helped me develop a greater awareness of my emotional patterns and allowed me to respond more skillfully to challenging situations. For example, I began to notice that I tended to get more irritable late in the afternoon when I was tired. Recognizing this, I could adjust my routine to include a brief period of rest or meditation at that time, which often prevented unnecessary emotional reactions. Another practice I found particularly useful was cultivating detachment. In Buddhism, attachment is seen as one of the main causes of suffering. I learned that many of our negative emotional reactions arise from our attachment to certain ideas, expectations, or outcomes. To work with this, I began practicing what I called a letting go meditation. In this practice, I would visualize something I was attached to. It could be an idea about myself, an expectation about how things should be, or even a material object, and then gently imagine myself releasing that attachment as if I were letting go of a balloon into the air. At first, this practice felt difficult and sometimes even scary. I was afraid that by letting go of my attachments, I would lose something important. But over time, I began to realize that detachment didn't mean not caring or being indifferent. Instead, it was about creating space for acceptance and flexibility. A powerful example of this occurred when I was invited to lead a meditation retreat at another monastery. I had meticulously planned every aspect of the retreat and was very attached to the idea that everything would run exactly as I had envisioned. However, on the very first day, a severe storm caused a power outage that lasted for hours, completely disrupting my carefully planned schedule. Initially, I felt a wave of frustration and anxiety, but then, remembering my practice of detachment, I took a deep breath and asked myself, can I let go of my expectations and work with what's happening right now? Surprisingly, by releasing my attachment to the original plan, I was able to improvise a series of activities that ended up being even more meaningful for the participants. We used the darkness as an opportunity to practice meditation in darkness, something many had never experienced before. This experience of letting go was profound and transformative. I realized that my quest for emotional control was actually a journey of self-knowledge and acceptance. True peace didn't come from controlling emotions, but from understanding and accepting them as part of the human experience. In the days that followed, I dedicated myself even more to the practice of mindfulness. I began to observe my thoughts and emotions without judgment, like a curious observer. I realized that much of my distress came from resistance to what was happening in the present moment. One morning, while meditating by a stream, I had another powerful insight. The water flowing before me was a perfect metaphor for the impermanence of life. Just as we can't hold on to the water that passes, we can't cling to moments or emotions. Everything is in constant change. This understanding brought me a sense of freedom. I realized that I no longer needed to struggle against my emotions or try to control them at all costs. Instead, I could learn to flow with them, like the water in the stream that flows around the rocks in its path. I began to incorporate this wisdom into my daily life. When I felt anxiety, instead of trying to suppress it, I would acknowledge and accept it. "Hello, anxiety," I would say mentally. "I know you're here, and that's okay." Surprisingly, this acceptance often diminished the intensity of the emotion. As I practiced this approach, I noticed significant changes in my life. My relationships improved as I was more present and less reactive. My work became more fluid and creative, as I was no longer trapped by the fear of failure. One of the most valuable lessons I learned was about compassion, not just compassion for others, but also for myself. I realized that I had been my harshest critic for years, demanding perfection in every aspect of my life. By cultivating self-compassion, I learned to be gentle with myself in moments of difficulty. The practice of gratitude also became central to my life. Every morning before starting my meditation, I would mentally list 5 things I was grateful for. Sometimes they were simple things, like the warmth of the sun on my face or the taste of tea. Other times they were deeper realizations or connections with loved ones. This practice shifted my perspective, helping me see the beauty and abundance that already existed in my life. Detachment was another concept that revolutionized my approach to life. I began to question my possessions and simplify my lifestyle. I discovered that the less I clung to material things, the freer and lighter I felt. This extended to my ideas and beliefs as well. I learned to hold my opinions lightly, open to new viewpoints and learnings. As my spiritual journey progressed, I began to share my learnings with others. I started a small meditation group in my community and was surprised by the interest it sparked. People from all ages and backgrounds came to learn about mindfulness and Buddhist practices. One day during one of these sessions, a participant asked me how to deal with anger. I shared with her a technique I had learned. When you feel anger arising, stop for a moment. Take a deep breath and try to locate where you feel the anger in your body. Is it a tightness in your chest? A heat in your face? Just observe this sensation without judgment. Then imagine yourself taking a step back and seeing the situation from a broader perspective. Ask yourself, 5 years from now, will this still be important? Often, this perspective can help diminish the intensity of the emotion. I saw her eyes light up with understanding. Moments like these reminded me of the transformative power of these teachings. As the years went by, I continued my practice and studies. I traveled to monasteries in Tibet and Japan, deepening my understanding of Buddhism and other spiritual traditions. Each experience added a new layer of understanding to my practice. One of the most profound lessons I learned was about the nature of suffering. The Buddha taught that suffering is an inevitable part of life, but that we can learn to deal with it wisely. I understood that much of our suffering comes not from events themselves, but from our reaction to them. I remember a particularly challenging moment when I received news that a close friend was seriously ill. Initially, I was overcome with sadness and fear. But then, remembering the teachings, I took a deep breath and observed these emotions. I acknowledged the pain but didn't let myself be consumed by it. Instead, I channeled my energy into supporting my friend in the best way possible. This experience taught me a lot about how to deal with life's difficulties. I realized that we can't control everything that happens to us, but we can choose how to respond. This understanding brought me a sense of peace and resilience that I carry with me to this day. Over the years, I saw many people benefit from these practices. I saw stressed executives find balance through meditation, couples on the brink of divorce rebuild their relationships through mindful communication, and people dealing with chronic illnesses find strength and acceptance through mindfulness. One of the most striking stories was that of a young woman who was struggling with depression. She started attending our meditation sessions, and gradually, I noticed a change in her. Her posture became more upright, her eyes brighter. One day, after a session, she approached me with tears in her eyes. "For the first time in years," she said, "I feel hopeful. I realize that I am not my negative thoughts. I can observe them come and go without identifying with them." Moments like these reminded me of why I had chosen this path. Each life touched, each moment of insight shared, was a confirmation of the wisdom of these ancient teachings. As I grow older, I feel a deep gratitude for everything I've learned and experienced. I now see that the emotional control I initially sought was just the beginning of a much deeper journey. It's not about controlling emotions, but about understanding them, accepting them, and using them as tools for growth and understanding. Today, at 70 years old, I continue my daily practice. Each morning I wake up before dawn to meditate. I observe my thoughts and emotions arise and pass, like clouds in the sky. I feel a deep connection with everything around me, the trees, the wind, the people passing on the street. My life is not free from challenges. I still experience moments of sadness, frustration, and fear. But now I see these emotions as teachers, each offering a valuable lesson. The difference is that I am no longer controlled by them. Instead, I dance with them, accepting their presence and learning what they have to teach. Looking back on my journey, I see that every step, every challenge, every moment of joy and sadness was necessary. They all brought me to this present moment, where I can sit in peace, grateful for life in all its forms. If there's one piece of advice I can leave for those who are beginning their own journey of self-discovery and emotional balance, it's this: be patient and gentle with yourself. Change doesn't happen overnight. It's a gradual process, sometimes painful, but always transformative. Practice mindfulness daily, even if only for a few minutes. Observe your thoughts and emotions without judgment. Cultivate gratitude for the small things in life. Be compassionate to yourself and others. And always remember, you are not your emotions or thoughts. You are the conscious observer, capable of choosing how to respond to each moment. As the sun sets and I conclude this reflection, I feel a deep peace. I know that my journey continues, and each day brings new opportunities to learn, grow, and share. May all beings find peace and freedom in their own journeys.